Geez, okay. Good evening, and welcome to the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name is Annie. I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which, if you're not familiar with us, is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is your first virtual event with us. Welcome. If it's not, welcome back. Thank you so much for continuing to support our events program, even as it moved into this digital format over the past year. It's been a lot of fun, and we're so excited to have another great virtual conversation here between two wonderful authors. And we're going to be talking to E.J. Levy about her new book, The Cape Doctor, and she's going to be in conversation with Rebecca Makkai. So thank you both for being here. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of those two wonderful speakers and then get out of your hair. I would also like to mention that there is going to be a chance to ask questions at the end of the hour. So if you're watching, you can use the comments or the live chat section, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, to say hello, ask questions, or just let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing people tuning in from all over at these things. It's one of the cool perks about the virtual format. So say hi, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the show. Speaking of the comments and chat section, that's also where I'm going to be putting a link to The Cape Doctor at the Majors and Quinn website if you want to check that out. We have them in the store. If you're watching and you're in the Twin Cities area, Majors and Quinn is open to browsing, so you can swing by in person if you'd like. We're open 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. daily. But of course, our website has been the place to go for many people this past year, and we offer next day pickup as well as shipping to anywhere, pretty much. We ship internationally as well as everywhere in the US. So with that said, I'm going to get moving here and introduce these two wonderful writers. E.J. Levy's work has been featured in Best American Essays, New York Times, The Washington Post, The Nation, and The Paris Review, and has received a Pushcart Prize. Her story collection, Love in Theory, won the Flannery O'Connor Award and the Great Lakes College Association's New Writer Award. Her anthology, Tasting Life Twice, Literary Lesbian Fiction by New American Writers, won the Lambda Literary Award. She holds a degree in history from Yale and an MFA from Ohio State University, and currently teaches in the MFA program at Colorado State University. The Cape Doctor is her first novel. And Rebecca Makkai's latest novel, The Great Believers, was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. It was the winner of the ALA Carnegie Medal, the Stonewall Book Award, the LA Times Book Prize, the Clark Fiction Prize, Midwest Independent Booksellers Award, and the Chicago Review of Books Award. And it was one of New York Times' 10 best books of 2018. Her other books include the novels The Borrower and The 100-Year House, and the collection Music for Wartime, 4 stories from which appeared in Best American Short Stories. Rebecca is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University, and she's artistic director of Story Studio Chicago. And you can find her at RebeccaMakkai.com. Rebecca and EJ, thank you so much. I can't wait to hear this conversation, and I will be back later to help you go through questions. Have fun.
Thank you. So I'm so excited to be talking to you.
I'm so excited to be talking to you. It's such an honor. I'm such a huge fan. Thank you for taking time.
And you were actually one of the very last people I hung out with before lockdown.
I know.
Way back, which, so at Story Studio, which was just mentioned, I was doing a class for people with debut novels coming out in the near future. And this was like early March of 2020. And this, at this point, the book was still so far off. It was very real, but it was, we didn't know what on earth the world would look like. It was clear that even then, this was one of the last things anyone was going to do for a while. So this is a good bookend, I think, on all of that.
It really is. And I remember you saying that you had debated whether or not to cancel the class in Chicago, to cancel the seminar in Chicago. And a couple of people were online, and it was sort of, well, we don't know how big a deal this is going to be. And that was the weekend. And after, So.
It was very, I think everyone remembers, and for different people, it probably happened at a different moment, but that kind of like just borderline of, oh God, what's happening? Can we still, what do we do? Just don't touch your face. So, but you know, I assuming that, you know, Lord knows, assuming that no germs were spread, it was a lovely connect with people. You know, and that, you know, I remember hearing about the book at this point. You'd sold the book, certainly. I think it was, you know, still kind of in that pre-publication editing limbo. So let me ask you an absolutely bizarre question that's going to be impossible to answer. What's changed? What's happened in the past year and 3 months, 3 months? You know, what have I missed?
You're so wonderful. Well, when we met in Chicago, the book was slated to come out, I think it was October 6th last year.
Okay.
And when COVID really hit, my book, as with many other books, was paused.
Yeah.
And that was scary, but it was also a huge relief because we were doing remote schooling. And with my little 6-year-old at a computer all day, my teaching on, you know, and then it made the whole process easier to hit pause because I could take time to do another fact check and another fact check.
Wow. Okay.
And so it's really, this is so delightful as a time to have the book come out just as we are all kind of emerging, and to have it be Pride Month as, you know, a longstanding LGBTQ, you know, activist and a queer person. So it just all feels really celebratory and lovely, when it frankly wouldn't have been for me in October. Things were just really hard for all of us, you know. And so
when did they make the call? How much, I mean, was this like September that they suddenly said this, or did you know a while back?
I think it was July that we finally made the call. So it was a couple of months in.
Okay.
But long enough to really be able to plan and to have a chance to write, you know, essays and all of that. But your advice, I have your advice in my head. Your very good advice about how to handle this. And one of the great pieces of advice that you gave was to make a list of things that you hoped for, so that you could celebrate those, you can work toward them, you can celebrate them, and understand that there are still going to be things on that list that don't happen for the book, but that will be for the next book or the book after that. To sort of kind of have a long sense of the timeline of the road that you're walking as an artist, and in conversation with other books, with other writers, with the world. So
have some of the things on that list happened so far, or are you still?
They have. I can't talk. Yeah, I can't talk about all of them, but some of them have. So there've been nice things. Yeah.
Okay.
Some really nice reviewer at Booklist at the American Library Association called the book an unforgettable work of art, which is really nice. So I'm going to have that
right across the cover,
you know, on the shoulder.
Yeah. Just get a tattoo right there.
That's really it. But I wanted to ask you, actually, I know, if I may, that that I'm such a huge fan of The Great Believers. And I know in both of our cases, there's a kind of argument that these are historical fictions that are recounting queer lives in different ways. But I know you worked a lot from archives and from interviews, as I did, although I also relied on a lot of brilliant work by biographers and historians that were available in a way that I know was evident from your work was not true with the AIDS epidemic in Chicago, those books had not been.
Or there was not that there wasn't anything, but there weren't the big books about AIDS in Chicago that you would hope there would be, right?
But you so beautifully evoke the experience of being queer and out in 1985 when you were just a wee child, and I was actually, just coming out then, and, going to pride parades in New York, and we were just getting a kind of purchase on what the hell was happening with HIV and AIDS. But you so perfectly capture the sense of the kind of beautiful party that it was to be queer in the 80s and out. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you translated the research that you did into this kind of beautifully embodied experience.
It's very kind of you. I can answer that briefly, and then you need to answer.
Okay. But I just really, thank you.
So, that's very sweet. Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm very interested in hearing about your research process. One thing that I had at my disposal that that you couldn't have had was interviews with people who directly lived this. I'm sure, I don't know if you interviewed historians, and you had the written records of various things, but I could sit down with people at Dunkin' Donuts or whatever and have those conversations, and I could have those same people read sections of the book or read the entire book and let me know, we just wouldn't have done that. That's not the expression, whatever it was. Down to my husband, who, had nothing to do with this scene. He's a little bit older than me, and he's the one who I put a cup holder in someone's car in like 1986, and he's like, no. Like, oh yeah, thanks. But he's like, ashtray. I think it's the work that fiction always is, which is this strange, filtration. It's these leaps of imaginative empathy. It's, sort of taking some elements of the real world, more for some books, less for others. Right? We make a different commitment to reality and to realism with every fictional project. Am I making up just these people? Am I making up the whole city? Am I making up the planet they're on? Right? The different commitments. And it's a matter of, I think for all of us, it's a matter of then I make that commitment to reality. So I have whatever that is over here. And on the other side, I have, my own imagination. The balance between those two is going to be different for every project. And, when you have historical record to work with, when you have the burden of lived history to work with, that's going to tilt it in a certain direction, right? Partly in terms of your obligations and partly in terms of what resources do you have available? Like if I'm writing about a made up city in a made up country, I can't really turn to much of anything for guidance. It's just all up to me, right? So I'm going to turn the question back on you. I'd love to know, and I wonder, we might have people tuning in here who were just like, I'm bored and I love Magers and Quinn, and they don't know what the book is about. So I wonder if, by way of answering the question, if you could first give us just a little bit of summary of the Cape Doctor, if there's anyone in the audience who is at sea here wondering what we're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So The Cape Doctor is literary historical fiction. It's my debut novel. It's inspired by the life of a remarkable 19th century surgeon, army surgeon, Dr. James Miranda Barry, who was born, we now know, Margaret Ann Bulkley, around 1795. And really transformed medicine in the English colonies in the 1810s and 1820s. And so some of the remarkable things that Barry did include performing the first known successful cesarean in Africa, finding a botanical treatment for syphilis and gonorrhea, really improving the healthcare for women, for the enslaved, and for Native peoples in the English colonies. But Berry was also a scandal. And so in 1824 was caught in an international sex scandal, accused of sodomy with the aristocratic governor of Cape Town, Lord Somerset. And that was a capital crime at the time, so it was a very serious accusation. And subsequent to that, eventually Berry rose to be an inspector general of military hospitals. So rose to a great height as an army surgeon, was wildly well-renowned. Napoleon himself called for Dr. Berry from his deathbed on St. Helena's in 1821. But when Berry died in 1865, the Layer Out discovered and reported that Dr. Berry was a perfect female with evidence of having carried a child. So my novel, which names Dr. Berry Jonathan Perry instead of James Berry, recounts Margaret's and Jonathan's rise from really very modest origins in Cork, Ireland, to be one of the most renowned and admired medical men of his time, of their time.
Wow.
And for me, in terms of archives, biographers have done a terrific job. Many of Berry's circle are renowned philosophers, artists, revolutionaries, progressives who believed in women's education when that was much in question at the start of the 19th century, when Wollstonecraft, among others, were arguing for this. So we know a lot about Berry's circle, and the doctor left a voluminous record of medical practice, but we have very little, we know very little about how Margaret or James, or in my case, Margaret and Jonathan, felt about their lives intimately. We have a couple of poems and a few letters from Margaret as a kid, and a few letters from James as an adult. But so for me, it was a chance to, I felt kind of compelled and called to imagine into the gaps, into the private thoughts, and what it was like to live that life. You know, it's really the, if you'll forgive me a quote, I love this essayist, Megan O'Grady, who wrote in the New York Times a couple of years ago about historical fiction, and said that it arises out of the belief that it's possible to tell stories about a vanishing past that bear on the immediate present, forged at the place where the archives end and the author's imagination begins, that it's born of the desire to hit the pause button, to quote, awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed, unquote, as Walter Benjamin puts it. And I love this. I mean, I really feel like it's kind of this desire to make whole what's been smashed and to awaken the dead.
That's an incredible quote. And that's exactly what it is, right? That's you know, we're doing that in the present in different ways, but when you write historical fiction, there's a reason people like to read historical fiction, and it's not necessarily specifically to learn about what are the facts of what do we know that literally happened here, because that would be a biography, that would be right, that would be a nonfiction, general nonfiction text. Right. What historical fiction is that meeting of the record and the imagination. I would imagine that changing Dr. Berry's name gave you, you know, do you feel like that gave you a lot more license psychologically as a writer? Do you feel like what was behind that decision?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, it's a good question, and a couple of things were behind it. I mean, partly it's that there was a Twitter controversy when the book was announced
Right.
that was really painful to me. Because as a queer person, I felt this is my tribe, and they're the last people I want to offend. But much of that revolved around concern that my novelization not become an erasure or a kind of copywriting of Barry's life, neither of which is my aim. So by changing the name to Jonathan Perry, I kept Margaret's name, changed the last name, because I want to honor the dead, but I want to acknowledge that there are many ways to imagine our way into this life, that Barry is both a feminist icon and a trans icon. And the fact is we don't know how they felt about this transiting of gender. Certainly it happened at a time when Margaret could not enter medical school, could not have achieved all that was achieved, had she not taken on a male identity. But we don't know how they felt about that, how Margaret and James felt about it. So, so it was very freeing, to change it to Jonathan Perry. Feels freeing at the same time that I hope the book will bring attention to the lives of Margaret Bulkley and James Barry. I was shocked when I first read about Barry on a trip to Cape Town with my partner, like 10 years ago, and had never heard of this astonishing figure, and we should, you know.
I'd never heard it either. I think after I met you last spring, I think I Googled it a bit, but that really, it was certainly not something that had come up in my reading or my kids' reading, anything like that, which,
And I think it's useful that it's because of Naimura's wonderful book about the Blackwell sisters and Elizabeth Blackwell, who is the first woman known to have received a medical degree in 1849 in the United States. And Elizabeth Garrett Anderson is the first woman to have received, to be licensed to practice medicine in the United Kingdom. And that was in 1865, the year Barry died. That I think that it's also part of feminist history and medical history, even as it is, this story is meaningfully part of LGBTQ history.
One of my favorite, so Maria Montessori, the educator, was the first woman in Italy, what's now Italy, to receive a medical degree. And one of my favorite stories about that is that she was, allowed to study there at the University of Rome, but she wasn't allowed to examine cadavers alongside her male classmates because that would be untoward. So she had to go and alone deal with the cadavers in the dead of night. Which is like traumatic enough as it is. And then so what they did is she hired a man who was going to escort her to and from the buildings. But in the meantime, she paid him to sit there and chain smoke and blow the smoke of every cigarette directly into her face to mask the smell.
Wow. When was she granted a degree? That's fantastic.
That's a good question. I know that she began the first Montessori school in 1906. So I believe this was the 1880s or 1890s. This was something. Yeah.
Well, one of the weird facts that I came across in terms of cadavers and autopsy and all the impediments that were put in the way of women who wanted a medical education, an education of many kinds, but that one of the things that fascinated me about the history of autopsy was that bodies were often smoked or treated with soaked in wine so that to preserve them right? But that this was seen as really desecrating God's handiwork, to be examining too closely the body.
Yeah.
So, but I should say, I did get to interview, I couldn't interview the dead, but I did get to interview wonderful living physicians who helped me figure out what was the likely course of the cesarean. Because I really had that when I was in Chicago to meet you. I was on the phone in the airport, which was empty afterwards, talking to various OBGYNs about, so what would this have been? You know, would this have been the position? How would this have happened?
Oh, God. Did you get to the Museum of Surgical Science while you were in Chicago?
I did not.
Next time.
I did go up to Philadelphia to the Mutter, which has it's a wonderful medical library. And they had instruments that they showed me, all kinds of like wild instruments, and just wonderful documents. So to be able to read about other epidemics by colonial army surgeons was really helpful, and to be able to hold and examine books that Barry almost certainly would have examined in his training in Edinburgh was marvelous, and really felt at times like there was this kind of bodily shock, like, oh, that, you know, they must have seen this. Margaret must have seen this in the General's Library, and James must have seen this at Edinburgh. So,
and you describe early in the book, you describe those books that Margaret finds just so in such exquisite detail. It was, you know, it's not, you know, it didn't take me out of the book to go, the author must have actually. It just felt so tangible and so physically real. And it's a moment, I think, when this person, you know, it's that moment of like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. This is my life. This is, you know, that moment of epiphany. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, for me, it was a moment where I thought, oh, this probably was a pivotal moment for Margaret, who almost certainly would have seen that volume in London, in the General's Library, that to experience the body not as an object of a male gaze, but as the subject inquiring into the beautiful puzzle of the body, you know, that how powerful that must have felt and been. So, yeah,
it's incredible. Speaking of the beginning of the book, we were hoping to get you to read a little bit from maybe early in the book. Would you be willing to do that?
I would be delighted. Thank you. And so, as I think I said, as we were getting ready to come on, the British actress Mary Jane Wells, who reads the audiobook, is so extraordinary. When I heard her read, it gave me chills, because I thought, oh my God, this is the voice I've had in my head. So I don't feel like I read as well as Mary Jane Wells, but I will read the opening paragraphs from the first chapter, chapter 1, Fortunate Son. She died so I might live, Margaret. I owe her my life. Not a day goes by when I don't think of it, of her, as not a day goes by when I don't think of him. She died so I might live. But isn't that the lot of women? To sacrifice as our Lord was said to have done. Few speak of Mary's sacrifice, of course. That, we are to assume, was unexceptional. To martyr oneself for others is the expected lot of mothers and daughters. It's rarer in sons except in war. So naturally, given the choice, I chose to be a son. Given the choice, who wouldn't? There are so many things we do not know until it is too late. Among them, that it's never too late. The American ambassador Franklin said it best, quote, I want to live so I might see how it turns out, unquote. We do. I can see that from where I am now, wherever that is in this almost afterlife of imagination or fact. Who can say for sure which it is? I can see that my life will be a scandal and an inspiration. Charles Dickens will write of me, and Twain, even Havelock Ellis. I will be a riddle that generations will try to answer. A riddle I am trying to answer now. When I was a boy, I was told that when I began a story, to begin at the beginning and continue to the end, so I shall. The question, of course, is where it all began. Where does any story start? Where did mine? The ending, alas, is always all too clear. But to understand my beginning, you must understand her end, Margaret's. Although it's been a very long time since I saw her, more than a lifetime or several, I recall her vividly, though now she is more like an echo, an idea I once had, a dream. Yet for years, when I looked in the mirror, I saw her, looking back with my blue eyes. And somewhere in a parish church in Cork, there's a baptism record for the second child of Mary Ann and Jeremiah Brackley, who was christened one early April, our parents' eldest daughter, Margaret Brackley, an ungainly name for an unpromising start. No one who'd ever seen Margaret Brackley in her infancy would have supposed her born to be a heroine, or so Jane Austen might have written of her had she been informed of Margaret's entrance into the world in 1795 or so. Her situation in life, her mother and father, her own person and disposition were all equally against her. Her father was a prosperous greengrocer in Cork, without being neglected or poor, and a very respectable man, though his name was Jeremiah, and he'd never been handsome. His eldest daughter, Margaret, had a thin figure, sallow skin, unruly red blonde hair, and diminutive features, and not less unpropitious for heroism seemed her mind. She greatly preferred dogs to dolls. She had no taste for needlepoint or drawing or dances. There was nothing in the appearance of Margaret, in short, that would have suggested her as a likely heroine of this or any story. And she had what was considered to be, in the late 18th century, as in too many centuries before and since, that most appalling defect at birth. She was born a girl. So I should say, thanks, I should say that paragraph is aping very closely Jane Austen's opening to Northanger Abbey, because I wanted very self-consciously to put this book in conversation with other books about female heroism and transformative education, to partly to kind of speak to the fact that novels are built things, but their narratives, as to some extent, are stories of sex and gender and race, etc., are, and that these are scripts that we inherit but can transform and make our own. So anyway.
Oh, I'm hearing a weird echo in myself. Are you hearing that?
I can mute myself.
Maybe that, for the moment. Sorry. I only have one voice, I promise. It'd be really cool if I was doing some ventriloquist thing just to fuck with you. So I'm finding that fascinating that you're talking about what makes a lot of sense to me, intentionally putting this story in conversation with other narratives of, say, the 19th century, the 18th century. At the same time, there are a few nods throughout to what I think of as kind of our present. Like, you have this really interesting section on page 116 where it's sort of almost like a floating little interlude. It's talking like, I will be dead less than a month, right? So it's like talking from afterwards. And I'm not going to find it right now as I look at it, but I'm impressed with myself that I found the page. But it's talking about, even now, that is simply being who I was, witty, difficult, charming, obstinate, brilliant, angry, no longer pretending not to be that person. That is the scandal, the real shocker, even now. And I take that now to be a present lens. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm so curious with about, first of all, that balance between being in conversation with texts of around that era and having a conversation with the current lens through which we'd see a story like this. And there's this real kind of unavoidable, I don't want to say danger, because it's not necessarily a danger, but this unavoidable thing with historical fiction where we have a lens of presentism, right? That you partly, it can come out as like, any female character in a 16th century or whatever must secretly be a feminist. Like maybe they weren't. The way that we want to see things now, the way we need to see things now, the way things make sense to us now. My analogy for this is always that when you watch like a movie that's like a period drama, let's say it's about the 1600s, but it was made in 1985. You can still totally tell it was made in 1985 because like they kind of have perms and like the eyebrow shape and stuff. And it's like, I can still see I can see your 1985 showing in a way that must not have seemed like much of anything at the time, right? But you watch Amadeus now or something and you're like, she's got a perm, man. Like that's so sorry if that's a rambling kind of inchoate question, but I'm curious about that lens of presentism. How and I'm not as interested in necessarily in readers' opinions about this at this point. I mean, that's interesting too, but I want to ask you. How did your present lens affect the writing? Was it something that you tried to speak to shut down, to see past, to see through? How did that work?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I hope that the book is not. I mean, I think one of the things that was fascinating about writing this was having to do the research to try to locate myself in a cultural, intellectual context from 200 years ago. Basically, Barrie was in Cape Town 200 years ago. Napoleon was dying 200 years ago. And I was really interested in how an Aristotelian idea of gender as a spectrum, sex as a spectrum, was true then, and how much kind of embrace of, and I don't want to offend historians out there, but how much gender fluidity there was, gender performance there was, even as women were living under, in England, at least coverture, whereby their legal rights and economic rights were suspended in favor of their husband if they were married. So I guess it's to say that a lot of the presentism, I think, reflects the fact that these were questions uppermost in the minds of intellectuals and philosophers of that time as they are now, which is both cheering and depressing, right? Wollstonecraft was writing, about women's rights, the vindication. So was Mill. So much of the ideas, so many of the ideas that we draw on now, that so many of the issues that we are wrestling with now in terms of voting rights, in terms of racial injustice, in terms of women's rights, in terms of education, technological advancement, medical equity. These were pressing issues at that time. But what's depressing is to see how these were debated and championed. Things like women's enfranchisement, the need to dismantle racial inequality, in that case, chattel slavery. Active debates over national independence and voting rights. And there was this progressive movement that then is kind of crushed under Victorian binaries of many kinds and hierarchies of many kinds. So, I studied history in undergraduate, and what the lens that I was looking through was intellectual history, which always acknowledges that the historian writing is always looking back as if, as a kind of Rorschach, that the writer now, historian or novelist, is always, in looking at the past, seeing themselves, seeing the present, refracting the present.
Yeah.
So I think it's inescapable. I certainly worked hard to try to waken the dead, as O'Grady says, to make whole what has been smashed. And for me, it was striking to realize how many of my coordinates are Victorian and 20th century. Whether it's germ theory, psychoanalysis, but physics, that is kind of, Einstein's revelations, that it was hard to shed that. And I hope I did it. I hope that the book will bring attention to how much that past is like our present, and how urgently we need to stand up for the values that Barry was standing up for then.
Yeah.
So.
I think it's really hard for people now, readers now, to really get their brain around the fact that there have been times of greater gender fluidity, of greater sexual fluidity, of greater, even this, I was talking to someone recently, they discovered that the college they'd gone to, the first Black student was admitted in like 1723. And the second Black student was admitted in 1960.
Oh my God! Right.
What the hell happened, right? But we tend to think we progress, the world moves forward, and it's hard, I think, to give credit to past eras, to past people, to past generations. It's hard to even give credit to our parents, right? We must. We invented science, and we're smarter than them.
Well, and yes, and the sense of kind of, the dismantling of the progress from Reconstruction and how that happened via a very conservative Supreme Court, a century plus ago, and that we are in danger of that now is quite unsettling. So.
Right. I think
not that you need my opinion on that, but
no. But I think that is one of the great dangers of it, the kind of confidence that we are going to fundamentally keep moving forward.
Right.
That all, and that we can't really lose ground because we're the ones who are enlightened, we're moving forward. And if we don't look at the times in history where things have become much more rigid. That's when,
and that is daunting, because it really was a time of great progressive argument and aims.
Yeah.
And Barry was part of that, embodying that beautifully. And I think must have found, the novel ends in the early 1830s. And part of that is because once, that latter stretch of Barry's life was hard to imagine. I think it must have been very, very hard to have been mentored by some of the great progressives and revolutionaries of the early 19th century, and to be a kind of embodiment of those ideals.
Yeah.
Only to find yourself in Victorian England, and she ascends the throne in, I think, 37. So, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
But I hope you didn't. I should say, I hope you didn't find the book seeming presentist. I guess it seems to me that it's a mirror, uncannily a mirror for our time.
Yeah, no, I didn't think that at all. I think I was, although I wanted your answer, I was really thinking more about reader reaction or not reader reaction. I think in the case of the early reaction to the book, or people who hadn't read the book at all, but really, we're looking at the subject matter through a very specific present day lens that I, sure, there's no argument to be made there, but I think that, historical fiction is very often trying to avoid that lens of presentism, even when it's very uncomfortable to us. And so that was really what was on my mind. It wasn't, it's not something I'm seeing in the book. It's something I think you very deftly both nodded at in sentences like that, where you're saying now, right? Whatever we take now to be, but that isn't skewering your vision, at least to me. So that was what I was getting at there. Yeah. Here's what I should say. We would love questions. And I have like one more question right now. I mean, I could keep talking all night. I have one more question I want to ask right now, but maybe as I'm asking that, you can completely tune me out and think some questions and then tune back in for the answer. And then we'll have Annie rejoin us to go through any questions that have come in. So my question for you, not the novel that I'm finishing right now. So I'm finishing one up right now, but the next novel that I plan to write is going to be weird historical fiction, not very accurate historical fiction about, though, a real living person. I'm not going to explain who right now in public. I'll tell you in private sometime, but I'm in an interesting situation where the person that I'll be writing about, I feel no obligation to do justice because this is someone who did some bad things in the world, essentially. So like, I have no qualms, but at the same time, I think there is just, even with this person who I have very little respect for that I'm writing about, there's that question of, well, it's a real person, it's a lived life. What would they think? Would they want this written about them? Am I invading someone's privacy in some way? And I think in the case of Dr. Barry, you have someone who, as you've written, was very, for obvious reasons, very afraid of being discovered, very, protective of the body, very protective of the self. So I'm of the opinion that, I'm generally the opinion that like someone's dead and they were a relatively public figure, they are fair game for historical fiction. But how did you wrap your mind around that? And did it give you pause? Did you think about like, if Dr. Barry could read this book, what would the reaction be?
I have such an embarrassingly hokey answer, but it's a sincere one.
Yeah.
Which is that when I first read of Barry on this flight to Cape Town, just a line, I was utterly, as my mom liked to say, ensorcelled. And when we were traveling around Cape Town, in the city, out in the countryside, I really had a voice in my head. Never happened before. But I really felt, I would look at the castle, we'd go hiking, I would see plants, and I would wonder, had Barry tried to extract, medicine from this very, particular endemic, flora there. How Barry would have been appalled by the conditions at the castle, what Barry would have thought of Toonhoos, the government house, on and on. And when I got back to the States and ordered a biography and started reading about Barry's Circle, I found that a lot of what I had imagined, that voice in my head, turned out to be true. And that happened over and over and over in the writing of this. And toward the end of it, when I started to delay because I didn't feel like I knew how to revise it well, I had a couple of bad dreams in which one, a midwife was insisting that I push harder and give birth. And I was like, no, be chill, it's fine. And then shortly after that, I dreamt Barry, very, very old, berating me, furious at me. I kid you not. And I woke up panicking. I was like, I have messed up with this book. You know, I need to get it out because, you know, in the dream anyway, it was this berating me for not finishing.
Oh my God.
So I'm not alone in this. Apparently Twain saw a painting of Barry, a portrait, and was felt compelled to write a brief sketch.
Wow.
So I think, you know, I don't expect it to happen again, but I guess I feel like this seems to me a spirit that wants to speak to our time.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not the only person captivated. I'm certainly not the only person interested in writing this story. But I wrote what I understand of it. And I felt I hope this is an honoring of a life that really deserves to be honored, both Margaret's and James's, or in my book, Margaret and Jonathan's. So I realize how kooky that sounds, you know, but it's sincere. It's true. So
listen, I mean, to write a novel, you're living for years with imaginary friends.
I know.
Like nothing sounds that kooky. Like,
well, wasn't it Vonnegut who said that any fiction writer basically is cultivating schizophrenia? You know, you're like invoking the voices in your head. So
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Good question. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, let's see if Annie can kind of apparate back onto the screen. Yes.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you. This has been so interesting, and we have some great questions. Also, just some really kind words about the passage you read, EJ. So, you know, thanks everyone for saying those nice things. So, first question has to do with that passage. From Maureen. The opening is so beautiful. I wonder if that arrived early or late in the writing of this novel.
Oh, that's so kind. That was part of that arrived very early before I knew I was writing a novel. I had that line in my head when I was in Cape Town. She died so I might live. So that felt, the initial chapters felt the composing was very easy. And what became difficult was ratifying my imagining with historical research, because I was writing very much in ignorance of that time. So.
Yeah, great. So that was sort of like a very early germ of the story, which is great. Here's one from Kristen. EJ, had you read a lot of historical fiction before writing this book? Did you read any while working on it, or were you mostly focused on the historical research?
That's a great question. I read a lot to try to get an accurate voice. So I was reading Austen and Bronte and Wollstonecraft and Shelley, also Dickens, though he's much later. You know, a lot of political tracts from that period, philosophers and intellectuals Barry would have come in contact with. I did read historical fiction to get a sense of how the machine was built, but that was wide-ranging from, you know, Yourcenar to George Saunders. The inspiration, I should say, was this, which I have, because have you read this?
I can't quite read the title there. Oh, no.
Nude.
Yeah, for those who are at home and can't quite read it, it's The Last Nude by Ellis Avery.
An amazing, amazing novelist. And the reason I brought it was, one, she is the writer who made me want to write a historical novel before I had gone to Cape Town.
Mm-hmm.
No, actually, right after, I realized. But also, this has the seed that you described once, Rebecca, of the great believers for writing a novel about an artist model in the 1920s in Paris, is what The Last Nude is. It's Tamara Delempica, or Delempica.
Yeah.
So
so
it's a
cool.
magnificent novel. I'm sending it to you. I just
Great.
want you to know. It's in the mail.
Oh my God.
But everyone should read The Last Nude. Buy it from Majors and Quinn. It's a brilliant, brilliant book.
I will find it.
So yes, I did read a range of historical fiction to get a sense of how that might be built. But mostly I was relying on work from the time, nonfiction and fiction.
I'm going to skip down to a question that's actually for Rebecca. What's the compelling story or driving force that makes you want to write a book about a real life person you don't respect without divulging too many details?
If I could explain who it was, it would make sense, I think. What I'll say is it's someone who I do have quite a bit actually of respect for some of what this person's life was. But this is a person who was complicit in some of the worst moments of the 20th century. And so I do think there's a story to be told there. It's someone I'm really fascinated by. And it's interesting because I'm not sure what my angle is on it yet, if I'm really getting inside this person's head with full sympathy, or if I'm doing something very strange and looking at her almost as a specimen under the microscope from the outside, the really strange point of view. And I'm not sure which I'm doing, but I think we tend to write about things that stick in our craw, just things that we can't let go of, things that trouble us. There are plenty of things in the world that are fascinating or that are beautiful. If it's just fascinating and beautiful, I'm not terribly compelled to write about it. I'm compelled to write about things that are fascinating and maybe beautiful and really troublesome or contradictory. And this is a person along those lines. So we'll see if I don't chicken out of writing it. I got to finish I have a September 1st deadline for my novel in progress, which is a very different book. And once that's done, I will start mountains of historical research. Here we go again.
Awesome. Okay, so it's a she. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly. I was thinking Leni Riefenstahl. Who are we? So.
All right, back to question for EJ. What was the most challenging part of writing this book?
That is a great question. I don't have an interesting answer to that. I mean, I feel like the initial composing was easy because I identified and I felt spoken to. I think continuing was hard because I started to lose my courage. And I spent about 1.5 years, 2 years on a really fruitless revision because I thought the structure was too conventional. It's linear, very 19th century in some ways. And I thought that wasn't smart enough. So I tried to make it a smarter book. So I think maybe one of the hardest things was to accept the book as I conceived of it, and to stand by that, to say this is, like little Lily Briscoe at the end of To the Lighthouse, I've had my vision.
Sorry, paper.
That's it, and to say this is not the only book, and this is something you talked about in March, Rebecca, that this is one book in the sequence, one is hoping, and so to trust the voice, to trust my own rendering, and to do the work to bring it out as fully as I could. So
it's interesting because the structure you have, I feel like it's completely appropriate. It reads in a way like a Bildungsroman, at least early on. And I see, I teach a novel class in Chicago as well. I've taught, 9 years of cohorts of really incredible debut novelists. And nearly everyone tries to do too much structurally on their first book. Almost, it's just this impulse of like, everyone's a great reader. They've read all this like high concept stuff. And it's like, they try to put it all, it's going to be 7 generations set on 5 continents. There's told backwards, but one point of view is a ghost. And the whole thing is in a journal that someone finds in a prison, but it was written, and you're like, stop. And the thing that first of all, I'm like always telling them, like, it is hard enough to write a linear story, and people enjoy a good linear story. There's nothing wrong with that. But also, like, make things harder for your characters, not your readers. Like, complicate the plot. Don't give your actual readers. Can you give the dog a bone? I'm talking to my child is going to grab the dog now. No, don't yell at her because I'm going to give her a bone. Okay. Sorry.
Well, if I can quote, I just heard George Saunders speaking with Daniel Torde, wonderful writers mode.
Yeah.
And Saunders quoted Chicago writer Stuart Dybek, right? As saying that story is always talking. You've just got to learn to listen. And I think that there's a way that the hard thing is learning to listen and then, do the work to bring it out fully.
Yeah. And not letting your ambitions, like your ambitions for your career, your ambitions for like what you want this book to be or how you want it to be read, those can't lead. The story has to lead.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
But you did. Well. You tried this revision and then you had the good sense to back off and kind of let it be.
Well, my agent had the good sense. I sent her the smarter version and she's like, this is terrible. I love the chapters you sent me before. Send me the other book. So
great.
I just undid all the stitching and went back to the
fantastic. Oh my God.
So, but
all right, well, let's do one more. We have one more question from Marley. It seems a daring narrative move to allow your first person narrator to know the future, to know what happens after his death. How did that come to you? I loved it.
You're so wonderful. I bet that is Marley from Mexico. If it is, huge.
Let us know, Marley.
Okay. One of my favorite books is Machado de Asis's Memorias Póstumas de Brás Cubas, so the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas.
Yeah.
And so I guess I felt that it was okay, since I had this voice in my head, to let the dead speak, to let the afterlife be a place from which one could speak, so that this is a kind of posthumous memoir. And I hope it does justice to the remarkable life. But again, I was, as the chapter titles suggest, I am looking to a lot of other novels in writing this one. So
yeah,
I felt enfranchised by that. But thank you for a great question, for great questions, and to Annie and Rebecca, thank you for this evening. This is so generous of you, and for those of you who turned in.
Yes, thank you everyone who was watching. I accidentally clicked on a comment. Cool that does that. Yeah, thank you everyone who was watching and for your wonderful questions. It is great to have you here, quote unquote, in this strange liminal space.
Can I just say, so Majors and Quinn was the first bookstore where I did my very first book event for my first book. And I was absolutely terrified. I remember like going, like I had some kind of media escort with me, and he like bought me a cup of coffee beforehand, and I was like shaking, and the foam and the latte was shaking in my hands. I was so scared. And I was terrified that no one would show up, and people showed up, and it was amazing. And that was just about exactly 10 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it's so funny because when we got on the call, EJ was also telling me that about 9 years ago, we did an event for her book.
Oh
For
my God.
story. And we had a big party there from Lucia's, which was a great restaurant right around the corner. But Majors and Quinn is fabulous, fabulous. Please support them. Whatever books you buy, support them.
Yes, and speaking of that, there's a link to the Cape Doctor up further in the comments there. I plugged that in, so that'll take you directly to the page for the Cape Doctor on the Majors and Quinn website. But you know, at the top of the page, there's a search bar, so you know you could do something like type Rebecca Makkai into the search bar, see what else we've got. So yeah, we would just really appreciate you watching this, and if you so choose, buying the books, because you know it really helps us keep putting these events on. You know, both online and in person someday. Oh, look. Yay. All right. Well, thank you everyone once again. And for anyone who was unable to tune in live, if you've got friends who couldn't make it tonight, this video remains available on the Majors and Quinn YouTube channel and Facebook page. So you can send people that way if they want to check it out. Once again, thanks to both of you, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.